Imagination book. And then, oh, okay, great. We're being live streamed. Welcome to anybody who's coming through on YouTube. Thank you so much for being a part of tonight's study. Because the Zoom platform is the only one where we're able to do live conversation with each other. If you have any comments or questions or want to add your perspective to what we're talking about, or the biblical text or the Holy Imagination book, please feel free to put your comments in the YouTube comment section. We have somebody from Metropolitan who will be taking a look back and forth, and we'll try to make sure that your comments get into the Zoom chat so that we can pull them into the conversation that we're having here. So we want to make sure that we hear from you as well, the best that we can right now. So again, very quickly, we're looking at Ezra, chapters 1 through 6 in the biblical text. And in the Holy Imagination book, we're looking at pages 127 and 128. And it's the very beginning of chapter 12. So if I could get 2 volunteers to read, that would be great. And we'll just split it by page. Yeah, okay. I see Sister Joan. And Sister Marion, were you just saying hello because you're here, or are you saying I'll read?
I'll volunteer.
Wonderful. I try to avoid the voluntold, although, you know, sometimes I do it. I'm going to admit that. So, but I do try to avoid it when I can. So, Sister Joan, if you would read starting at Identity Reconstructed, the very beginning there, to the end of the second paragraph, which ends with, "These are the internal concerns." And then Sister Marion, if you would start with Ezra and Nehemiah and read those 2 paragraphs. And if you'd like to just give us an overview of the table, that's fine, or just let me know and I'll jump in there. Okay, whenever you're ready, please.
Okay. Ezra and Nehemiah, separate books in the Old Testament, were considered one book in the Hebrew Bible, and so it makes good sense to consider them together. They are both concerned with the business of returning to the land and reestablishing identity, marking the beginning of the post-exilic period. In Ezra, sacrifice is reestablished and the foundation of the temple is laid. In Nehemiah, the wall around Jerusalem is built. The language describing the building projects is appropriate to the task. It is detailed and metaphorically specific and idealistic. This presentation of the practical work of the building of the temple and the walls of the city is easily understood as the reconstruction of a people. How does one rebuild something that has been lost for a long time? The challenge of rebuilding is that the context is always different. And for the most part, so are the builders. The memories of the past must guide what happens, but they can also limit what must happen. The building of the temple is central to Israelite/Jewish identity. In addition, there is the practice of sacrifice and the observance of holy days to be reinstituted. The Israelite priesthood must be reestablished to teach the people about what to eat, how to deal with diseases, and how to perform rituals for approaching God through worship. In the absence of these identity markers in practice, the people's memory of them can become nostalgic and idealized. These are the internal concerns.
Ezra and Nehemiah remind God's people that there are also external challenges. There are enemies whose interests will not be served by the rebuilding of a temple and wall. Moreover, what about the people who had been left behind in the land? Those who were not driven into exile. The people left behind were of less consequence to the Babylonians than those taken, but they were nonetheless Israelites. During the 70 years of exile, the debate about the identity of the true Israel escalated, whether God's people were those in the land or those in exile. Ezra and Nehemiah cover a period of about 100 years from the time of Cyrus's edict beginning in 539 BCE through the completion of the temple in 516, 515 BCE, to the restoration of the walls around Jerusalem in 445, 444 BCE. The books follow this trajectory. The outline says Ezra 1 through 6, worship is reestablished and the temple rebuilt, and the themes are worship renewed. Ezra 7 through 10, the Torah is reestablished. Nehemiah 1 through 7, the wall rebuilt. Nehemiah 7 through 10, Ezra reads the law. Nehemiah 11 through 13, building projects are completed, and the themes are the temple and the wall reconstructed and identity restored.
Thank you so much. There's a lot going on here. So even though there are some specifically detailed descriptions of what's going on, like these are some practical, like this many folks came from this group and this named group and this many, gold coins showed up and got raised and things like that, right? There's all sorts of specific things that are happening here. However, at the same time, this also reflects what we've been talking about for a long time now in many, many chapters. We have the group that has been in exile and trying to figure out, how did this happen? How in the world did we get here? How did we get from a people that was set apart by Yahweh, where we had this very direct relationship, even through Moses et al., a much more direct relationship. Then we have judges that have to come in and rescue us from this horrific and compounding cycle of terror. Then we have kings, just like everybody else. And we have to figure out who we are. Who are we in the midst of all of this turmoil? And while also trying to understand our relationship with the divine. There are theological themes coming all the way through here. As we remember, way back in Deuteronomy, this theology was pushing through all of the books that we've been reading, right? If you do good and God is, excited about it, the good things are going to happen. And if you're doing the wrong stuff and God is not excited about it, bad stuff's going to happen. And oftentimes it's going to show up like you're going to go to battle and it's not going to go your way, right? And then people were reverse engineering that. They would look at someone's life, or they would look at the win-loss scale of battle and say, if you're winning, God must be for you. If good things are happening, God must be with you. And if bad things are happening, that's because you're dishonoring God, you're disobeying God. This theology is pushing all the way through, and God's intervention, the theology of God's intervention, is pushing all the way through. So even in the chapters of Ezra, in the biblical text, it doesn't say King Cyrus is just, hanging around and was like, you know what, this is wrong. We should really have the people go back and be able to build their temple and the wall. No, theologically, what's happening in the narrative is that God says, hey, this is what's going to happen. And God just so happens to use King Cyrus to do it, right? And every time some obstacle comes up, God uses something else, right? God uses a different king to say something different. And oftentimes God will say, hey, y'all, go look at the documents, go look at the edicts, because when you find the edicts, you're going to see that this was supposed to happen. So even after generations passed and other enemies try to get in there and say, nope, you're not going to do it, God is the one who is seen in these narratives as being responsible for guiding the people to what they need in order for this to happen. So there's There's things that are happening theologically. There's things that are happening like spiritually, religiously, around ritual. And there's things that are happening around identity. Who are the true Israelites? Are they the people that were left in the land, that have been in the land the whole time? Are they the folks that are coming from exile? And if they're the folks from coming of exile, how do you prove it? And if you can't prove it, what happens, right? All of this stuff is happening in those first 6 chapters. So I say all that to say, that was kind of like the overview thing, right? A whole bunch of different stuff going on. When you're reading the Holy Imagination book or the biblical text, what is jumping out to you as significant? It could be anything, right? But let's start somewhere and see where the conversation takes us.
Can I ask the question, the people who were left behind, where were they? Because when they came back to Jerusalem, it was in shambles. Everything was destroyed. So where were they living? If they said they were left behind, where were they?
Yeah, if I mean, you can have folks still there in a space that's in shambles. So imagine that you leave a place and it's put together, right? It's in order. And then you come back and there's chaos everywhere. That you're focused on that, but not necessarily that everybody has been evacuated from the area.
So I guess there were not enough of the ones left behind to try to do any repair. They were just barely making it, I guess, themselves. They weren't able to reconstruct the city.
There's a couple of things going on there that could have contributed to that. And again, right now we're using our holy imagination. If there was somebody who was a biblical scholar of this, they'd probably be like, oh, the blah, 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 and the blah, 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 and the blah, blah, blah. And we can do that, right? I just can't do it off the top of my head. But if that's part of the conversation, that's great. But there are certain things that we can take into consideration, right? One of them is, if there's this exile, there's going to be trauma. There's going to be trauma for the folks that go, and there's going to be trauma for the folks that are left. So that's part of it. Another part of it is there's this external valuation going on, right? The people that took the exiles, that stole them from their land, were doing it based on a valuation that they were using, an external valuation system. So they created this hierarchy right away. We are taking the best of you. Now, again, as much as maybe the people's internal identity is trying to combat that or resist that, it's still there, right? The only reason I'm here is because those folks didn't think we were good enough to take us, right? So that's part of it. And also, we've got that Deuteronomistic theology playing too, right? So even though they're still in the land, it's ruptured. How is it possible that if we're doing what we're supposed to do, if we're obeying God, if God is on our side, we're not going to get ruptured like this? So now they're feeling less because of that too. So you've got all these things that are playing at the same time, and they have the folks that have been taken in exile. So they've lost a lot of the people that were helping to build the society as well. Like if all of a sudden somebody came in and took all the doctors, then it would be a lot of rebuilding to try to have people trained to learn on the ground how to help people, heal and things like that, right? So there's like a logistic side to it. There's a psychological side to it. And then there's just, a lot of times when there are people who are stolen into exile, there's also a lot of damage that happens to the buildings, and there's war that's happening at the same time, battles that are happening. So they have less people and they have more damage, and psychologically they've been hit. So I'm just saying there are a lot of different things that could contribute to that, I think.
Well, when you read about how long they were in exile, to me, it says that you have a whole different people coming back. They don't think like the people who left. They're not the same people. Probably a lot of the people who left are dead, and these are children and grandchildren who have very different views of what it means to be a Jew. And I'm not clear about the rituals, whether they were practiced in exile. So you've got that whole issue of what really should we be doing in terms of the rituals. There's probably debate about that. And then after this, after the noonday discussion, it occurred to me that you probably had intermarriage over the 70 years with people who weren't Hebrew necessarily. So what all of that, how do you deal with all of that too? So there's a lot to deal with. It's not so simple as just going back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, part of what one of the limitations of just a literal Bible study or a Bible study that's crafted around only one narrative, we miss some of this nuance that we're talking about right now, right? It's one thing to say, this is what happened. And then, because for some of us, when we read this, we never, in our own reading or in church, have we ever heard anybody talk about the folks that were left over, like the folks that were left in the land, right? I even said left over, right? Because we always talk about the folks that went into exile, right? The folks that remained are forgotten often. So even just by it showing up in this commentary allows for that part of the story to come forward. But yeah, there are a lot of different things at play. You said relate through what is happening in Ukraine. Say more, please. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with her because I can't imagine. They were saying that the people were coming back into the town after it had been bombed. And I'm thinking, how could they possibly, they think they're going to be hit again? So you just can't imagine. I mean, it's hard to imagine actually what they're encountering in their minds and how they feel about coming back under the attack.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then also the people that have left have stayed to endure in Ukraine, to endure the bombing. They've gone into safe places. And then after the bombing's over, they come out and see the destruction. And I guess this would be like during World War II in Britain, when they would go, the air raids would go off. So it was happening even back here in the time of Ezra.
Yeah, I would imagine people, when battle begins, if you're not in the battle, you're going to try to find a place to hide, to be safe, to survive it. And when the disaster is big enough, even just retreating for one period of time and then coming back out, it can be a mass difference than what you saw when you went into hiding.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm thinking of 9/11. I'm thinking of Charlottesville too. I mean, there's many, many examples. Those are just the ones that are coming to my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And in the midst of that, of what's going on, again, there's trauma that's happening. So how do you rebuild when you're trying to survive? When all of your energy is going towards survival, You're not going to be thinking about building things. You're going to be thinking about what it takes to survive, right? So if you're hungry, you're going to be thinking about how do we get food? If you need immediate shelter, you're going to think about that. Whatever the priority is of what's happening, that's what you're going to go with. But I can imagine, I'm even thinking, so I live in Baltimore City. There are some streets in Baltimore City that when you drive down them, it literally looks like a bomb went off. Like the buildings are all dilapidated. There's nobody there. There's very little greenery anywhere. It literally looks like half of a building will just be gone. It's not just, oh, that area is overgrown or something, right? It's literally, you go down that street, it literally looks like a bomb went off in there. And there's been a lot of economic destruction that has happened within Baltimore City. And when that happens over and over and over again for decades, and nothing is being replenished, or very little is being replenished in there, that's what you're going to end up with, right? So you have people that are trying to figure out, how do we pay for rent? How do we pay for food? How do we get by? And if you've got 3 jobs and you're trying to survive on 3 jobs and raise a family and, make sure your kids go to school or whatever else happens to be, you're not thinking about like, let's develop the blah, blah, blah. You're like, let's get to tomorrow morning.
The other question I had, I was sort of scratching my head when Jeremiah was, when the king wanted to build the temple first and then repair the city. It would seem like he would want to secure the walls and the city first and then build the temple. So I don't know, that thinking seemed to have been turned around to me.
Right. This came up in a slightly different way at the noontime session, because we talked about how they came in, they didn't even worry about the foundation of the temple, let alone the city and the whole, like what's going on with Nehemiah, right? They came in and they because it says they did all this stuff, they built the altar, they only built it based on the foundations because they were afraid of their enemies, right? They just wanted to do what was there. But after that is when they start talking about, then they built the foundation of the temple, right? So before anything else in the temple, they say, we've got to have the altar. And we had a really rich, deep discussion about the power of altar, right? And we talked about, not only did we talk about Metropolitan, right, AME Church and the actual altar there, but we just talked about altars in general, right? And that the people that are coming back from exile, and again, they're trying to make sense of how they went from a people who were set apart and protected by Yahweh to a people of exile. Now they have the chance to come back. They've been praying for generations to be able to come back to the land and rebuild not only their identity, but this relationship with Yahweh, right? And the first thing they do is set up the altar and reestablish certain rituals, right? That tells us about their priority, at least the way this narrative comes forward, right? Because again, if we had a biblical scholar that was deep, deep, deep into the history of this time, they could tell us certain things too. But just from the narrative alone, that was the priority. I'm gonna add. Oh, go ahead.
One of the themes that I was thinking about in reading it too was the whole issue of returning. And when you, like African Americans back to Africa and all of that all of those movements through the centuries, and can you really go back? Can you return?
Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot of nuance to that. And a lot of the writings show that. We want to, right, the readings, not me, because I'm white. The readings would say, we want to do this, this, this. And then even just the attempts to do it, whether they made it to Africa or not, the attempts to do it had complications. And then there was all sorts of back and forth about whether or not it was a good idea. And then what was happening. The AME Church is also in Africa. And there's all, even today, but when the AME Church was first going into African countries, there's still a lot, no matter how much folks wanted to be there, there's a lot of complication and nuance to that. One of the things that came up in the noontime class also was the kind of general dynamic of when someone goes off to college and then they come back home for the first time. Especially if they're from an area where not a lot of the people in their community, Kashmir's decided it's time to play. That's what you're hearing. That's my dog playing right now, just scratching up everything. That when folks come back from being at college, especially in communities where a lot of folks aren't going to college, there's a disconnect, not only for the person who's coming back, but also the community that's there, right? So, what does it mean for all of these folks, right? Because the groups that we're talking about in the biblical text are all claiming a similar identity, but they're coming from different perspectives. So is this identity big enough to be able to hold them all? One of the things that it says in the biblical text is that certain groups that were coming from exile couldn't prove that they were Israelites. So they couldn't prove their genealogy, right? And so they were being, left out. And especially if you were part of the Levite family, part of the priestly families, they weren't able to do that work because they couldn't prove they were Israelites. And that touches back into Sister Marion's comment also about Black folks in the US and Africa. There's a lot of genealogies that are lost forever. So even when we talk about it along those lines, identity is part of that. But then how do you prove the identity that you have?
Well, the whole, the Roots novel was all about that, or not novel, but that book, and then the series, and I remember right after the book came out, there were all these Roots tours to Africa. I actually went took a tour to Senegal, but they were capitalizing on the popularity of the book and the TV show and all of that. And it's interesting.
I'm sorry, I thought you were going to tell us more about the trip or what your experience of the trip was.
It was great. I'd been to the continent before, but not to West Africa. This was to Senegal. And in that trip, and also others that I took to East Africa, they include a naming ceremony where they give you an African name.
Wow.
I've forgotten them all because I just never used them, and I'm okay with Marion. But I do remember the first time I was in East Africa, in Zambia, years before, and I looked at the people, and they looked like people in my family. It was amazing because I've been to Europe, that didn't happen, and the people, like the vendors, they'd call me sister. And my sister, I give you a good price. But they really used, when they said sister, it probably was just a marketing device or tool, but I took it as something more, that they really were calling me sister. And I felt a different kinship, although I didn't feel African. And we talked about that, the people in the tour, and it's like, we aren't African. We're African American with all sorts of other ethnicities thrown in sometimes, European, Native, And as you would say, blah, blah, blah. So it's hard to, so how do you identify? What are you? And what do you go back to?
Well, we have the DNA now that matches us up. I have so many people that I have DNA matches with, but believe it or not, I've actually found some relatives through the DNA. So it does work.
Let me ask you this, Sister Joan. When you were doing the DNA test and you started to get the results back, how did that feel for you?
At first, I was skeptical about the DNA. I wasn't really sure that it was what all it was cut out to be. But then I started getting matches. And some of the matches, I didn't know. They didn't have a tree, so I couldn't match them with anybody on my tree. But then, and they were saying like second cousin, third cousin, all that. But then my niece got hers. And what's interesting is my sister and I married two brothers. So when her match came out, it was really high. It said, I forget what it said, first cousin. That's what it said, first cousin. I said, no, she's not first cousin. She's my niece. But it was the highest. She was the highest one on the list of matches. And then I got some more matches of like second cousins and third cousins. And I actually knew who some of them were. So I was like, oh boy, this really does work. And it does work. It does work. So now I only follow through on people who have a tree and I can see where we match. People who don't have a tree, I don't even bother because you don't know who you're connected with. But I've been able to reach out and locate some of those second cousins, and some of them have reached out to me too. So it's been very interesting.
I asked because, you know, we, especially in biblical study, we're going to talk about identity a lot, right? And we talk about it in church too, whether we talk about it explicitly or implicitly, we're talking about identity. And identity is a form of connection. And so, you know, part of why I asked that is that, you know, on the surface level, it's a DNA test, right? So you put information out there and you get information back at its kind of base level. But in addition to that, there are connections, family connections that you're making and then perhaps like reaching out for, right? And it's those connections that make that special or important or even interesting, right? Is that because otherwise it's just like, you know, okay, this is this piece of information that I learned over here or wherever. Sister Marion, please.
Well, my daughter, Joan, my daughter did our tree, and she had us both, you know, spit in the tube and send it all in and everything. I haven't done a tree yet. I keep saying I'm going to. So last year, she gets this communication via the DNA, by Ancestry.com, from a man who says, I think we are related. He says, he had a picture of my mother, but he was writing to Marie. He says, I have my grandparents had this picture of a woman I think is your grandmother. And he said that would mean that his great grandmother was my grandmother's sister. So it was like, oh my God. He sent a picture of the picture that he had, and we had the same picture of my mother. So of course we were related, but it's on my mother's side, and my grandmother was the last of 10, but the children didn't have a lot of children. So my mother was an only child, and the cousins that she did have were only children. So there weren't a whole lot of descendants, and I wasn't close to the ones that were there. I wasn't particularly fond of some of them, and so I didn't lament the loss of connection. But then, so this man, you know, connects with us, and clearly he's a cousin, And he turns out to be this most wonderful of persons, just a dream. In fact, I think I might have told him, I said, you're not really like those people because you're not really from that part of the family because you're really nice. And my grandmother's father was European American, and my grandmother had 3 brothers, but 2 of them were fair enough to pass and moved to Wisconsin from Kentucky. And the sisters could not go visit them, but they would come back and visit their sisters. So, I have no information about them. And every now and then when I get these strange matches from Ancestry.com, I'm wondering who in the world could these people be? They could be, who knows? They could be children of those men, my mother's uncles, whom she didn't know either. And what all that means, So how are they identifying? Are they, if they're from the brothers who passed, do they identify as African Americans or European Americans? And in fact, I said to my daughter when we started corresponding with this cousin, I said, I wonder how he presents. Does he present as the white Webbs or the brown Webbs? Because that would have made a lot of difference, in our relationship. But he presents as African American. And he had the same stories about the same people. And when I went to California to visit a college friend this summer, he's in Sacramento. So he came down to San Diego and spent the day with me. So, those connections are something else. And the fact that he was reaching out so, strongly and seriously, and I wasn't reaching out at all.
But what's interesting, I've had a couple of young women who had the same people on their tree that I had, and they were trying to find out who their father was. So they were looking for, that's a twist. They want to know who, I had one of the girls' grandmothers on my tree, and she was an aunt. And we were trying to backtrack to find out who had male children. So I gave her the information and I let her go search. And I said, you go search, this is all I can do. But that's amazing that she was trying to find out who her father was. I had 2 of them actually to contact me. They're trying to find out who their father was.
I find, as I'm listening to these stories, contemporarily, they're interesting on their own, right? It's identity, it's connection, it's intrigue, it's got it all, right? And then when we think about using these stories and others as an interpretive lens for the stories in Ezra, right? Ezra gives it like a news account. You all have been offering stories as testimony, right? Like testimonials to experiences. If we try to use our holy imagination and think about the chapters of Ezra, right? Everything that mentions, and then, these folks came from this family, and this group came from this line, and these folks couldn't prove their genealogy, so they were excluded, right? These folks couldn't be Levites because they couldn't prove they were from that family line of priests. These folks remained in the land, but were there, but not included, at least in the narrative of the building. So the folks that were originally from the land, but came from outside, which probably weren't even the same folks that left, came back in to build up an area as if it's their own, and is already making decisions amongst themselves about who's part of it and who isn't. And then making decisions there, right? So the nuance of what's happening in Ezra sometimes doesn't make it out of the very kind of reporter-ish, this happened and then this happened and then 14 pounds of this gold something or other showed up or whatever, right? That one of the themes that's happening, whether or not we as humans, and I don't mean us like contemporarily, I mean like humans over time, we are very quick to lean toward, who's included, who isn't, who's
Yeah.
part of this identity, who
Yeah.
isn't, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes there are very significant and important reasons why that happens. But one of the themes that's happening in Ezra is showing a God that is offering identity to a diasporic group of people. So if you've been in exile and you're coming back, or if you've been in the land the whole time, it's the same God. And one of the reasons that people, humans in general, will enact ritual is to connect us with the other folks that have enacted that ritual. So even if they were doing some of the ritual in exile, if they were doing it the best they could there, if they were doing it in different ways because generations had passed and there was no longer anybody, living that had done it back in the land, right? So they were just doing what they could, or what they remembered, or what they adjusted, or maybe they didn't have the same materials or access to the same materials while they were in exile, but still continuing enough of the traditions that when they came back, the first thing they wanted to do was set up that altar. And this is actually something I'm thinking of the first time. Now, I didn't think of it while we were talking about rituals in the 12 noon time, but I wonder, again, with my holy imagination, I wonder if it wasn't some of the folks who remained in the land who started talking with the folks that came back to build and started reminding them or sharing with them the importance of the rituals. And maybe it was them that brought that forward. And the longing that happens when somebody's been away and comes back, and that the ritual was the thing that connected them, right?
Yes.
Because that's part of why we enact ritual, is to connect us beyond our own physical space and even time. What do y'all think about that? I don't know. I didn't think about it before. I'm just putting it out there.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Check that one off. That's good.
Check everything.
Well, the whole question of identity is so can be very arbitrary,
Mhm.
because
Sure.
especially in America, people came here, their names were changed. Those who came voluntarily, they changed their names. The immigration officials changed their names. The spelling got messed up just by accident. So you can have a whole different name than what you left with or what your ancestors back in the country. And let's not talk about the Africans. That was totally changed. Totally.
Mhm.
I can give you two good examples. I used to work with a physician. He was a Jewish fellow, and his last name was Cooper. And he said, "That's not really my name." He said, "My mother changed the name when I think it was Kupenstein or something like that." So his mother changed her name when they came to this country, and he became Cooper. So if he didn't know that, supposing his children are coming along, and if he didn't pass that on, how would they know that they were related to the Kopensteins?
Mhm.
And then my roommate from nursing school found out when she was an adult that her last name really was not supposed to be Jackson, that her father was adopted by his aunt, and his name was something like Stewart or something like that. And he took on his aunt's name, which was Jackson. So when she was born, she was a Jackson, but he really wasn't a Jackson. She didn't find that out until she was an adult, that her father's real last name was not Jackson, but something else.
Right. Some of these are surprise moves.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But it's so arbitrary. We just,
Yeah.
if it happens, it just happens.
Right, exactly. It's the importance or the significance that we import to it, right? Or that we're taking from it, right? Name, if someone's name is changed by one's own agency, right? Someone changes their name out of their own free will. It's a much different experience than if your name is stolen from you, right? Changed beyond your will, right? And beyond your power in that moment, or generations back, right? And so even though, like, let's say you're the person that you went to nursing school with, right? When she was the same exact person, she had the same connections with the people that had whichever name, right? She had those same things, but things shifted because of what we import to names, right? Naming is incredibly important in different ways, right? It shows up differently in the Bible, like, and then humans named, the man named Adam, named blah, 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 right? Like all the things. And that's significant because when you're naming, there's a certain power to naming, right? When in different cultures around the world, naming of children happens in different ways. On a much, much, much more superficial level. When I adopted Kashmir, her name was Ballerina. And I was like, that doesn't work, right? Now, this dog, now known as Kashmir, was answering to Ballerina at the shelter, right? I didn't call her by a name for 3 days because I was like, I know it's not Ballerina and I don't want to reinforce that, but I haven't thought of what the new thing is yet, right? Now, again, this is a very, very superficial, example. But I'm thinking, if I took it this seriously about this dog, right? And I don't even call myself like a pet parent or anything. Like, I don't do any of that, right? But I still took this dog's name very seriously. There's something really, we import a lot of significance to names.
Have you read Roots?
I have. Mm-hmm.
So you know the importance of Kunta Kinte's name,
mm-hmm.
and how he clung to that,
Mm-hmm.
and how
Right.
that was passed on through all the generations,
Mm-hmm.
even despite the owner's attempts to change that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. As a very explicit form of resistance. And yes, absolutely. And oh, sorry, go ahead. Just jump ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm reading about when during the Civil War, after the Civil War, and the slaves were found to be free, and they didn't know what their last names were.
Mhm.
So they decided that they were not going to take their master's last name, but maybe they would take the name of a previous master that they had had.
Mhm.
And then some of them decided if they had a skill that they would take that name, like a blacksmith or a goldsmith or something like that. But
Carpenter.
they didn't have last names. They only had first names. So they had to give themselves names. And I went to this plantation down in Virginia, Fairfield, and one of the relatives still run it. It's a farm now. Anyway, she said when her great grandfather released his slaves, he told none of them to take his last name. So what were their names supposed to be?
Right. And if you're relying on, even if you're not relying on, but just have to deal with whatever legal structure is going on at the time, then there's a certain amount of interaction that is going to happen. So if you only have a first name, or you don't know what your name is, or you don't know what your birthday is, there are a lot of access issues at that point, and a lot of ways for injustice and oppression and harm to happen, and using that as an excuse. Well, we would have, but we didn't have this record or whatever. Okay, we have 4 minutes left. We've really, which is great. I'm so glad that our conversations go like this, and you don't have to listen to me talk for 60 minutes because, like, I don't even want to hear that. I'm thinking, I just keep going back to this, them trying to prove their identity, right? All the different lines, the different verses that show up in those first couple of chapters of Ezra that talk about them proving their family line. And that so much of what happens when they're rebuilding and after they rebuild has to do with identity, that if they have to prove it based on generations before, then some people were definitely excluded that even were part of the identity line that they were trying to protect. So what does it mean for us as Christians today to think about the diaspora of Christians and when it is significant to draw a line? Because it happens in both ways, right? There's Christianity that happens in very exclusionary, unjust ways. And there's the Christianity that is so inclusive, it puts up with everything, including injustice and oppression and harm. So for those of us who proclaim Christianity as part of our identity, what is it going to mean for us to draw lines that ensure that harm is not being included in what it means to be Christian, at the same time not excluding people because we feel like, well, we're the us and they're the them. We stayed, you were over here.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can't prove this, and then what is there to prove? What are you proving? Christians for a very long time in certain sectors of Christianity, white evangelicalism very specifically, is very concerned about saying particular words in particular formats and believing certain things and proclaiming those things. And if you don't proclaim those very things in that particular way, you are not Christian. And there's a whole host of Christianity that is based in practice. What do we do? You know, thinking of love as a noun or a verb, right? Like people talk about love as an action word, right? It's what people do or don't do, right? That makes up love. It's not this fluffy little Hallmark card or something. There are forms of Christianity where it's not so much in the things that you proclaim, it's more in the actions that you do. That's what they would say true Christianity is. Christianity is action, right? Okay, we got 1 minute. It's not, I can't believe we didn't solve it.
Well, it's not to be solved because
I'm kidding. I'm sorry. I was teasing.
No, I wish it could be, but people who put religion aside, groups are always drawing lines around themselves. Keep people out, keep people in. I mean, look at sororities, look at fraternities.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have to be the church.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think, one of the things that, perhaps we can talk about as the weeks continue as well, especially next week, because next week is Nehemiah's, the building of the wall, right? Again, what does it mean to draw lines? Are there lines that are good? Are all lines bad? Are there lines that are good? And then how do we navigate that, right? Sometimes if we just make a proclamation, but there's no reasoning behind it, even if that reasoning is because we believe, in this miracle or whatever, even if it's that, like without anything, then we're just following it without thinking about it at all, right? That somebody generations or 2 seconds from now could say, drawing any kind of line is wrong, right? And then that means including everything, but that also means including harm, right? There's lots of harm that has happened because, we just think differently about it. It's just their opinion. It's just how they grew up. It's just whatever, right? Harm can happen because of that. So how how, if at all, are we going to draw those lines? We can take that forward. Reverend Dr. Sandra, please, would you offer us our closing prayer?
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let us, and everyone, let us go to the Lord in prayer. Mighty God, we do thank you for the privilege of gathering in your study of Judy Fentress-Williams' Holy Imagination text of the really a theological and literary introduction to the whole Bible, with a specific emphasis tonight on Ezra and Nehemiah and the challenges that they both face in pursuing and fulfilling the call that you placed on their lives. Thank you for allowing us to see how history is contextualized within everyday conversation, which took place during this lesson tonight as people discussed identity and relationships. And I'm sure that the people then, as the people do now, talk about relationships and privilege and outcast and incast and politics and other ticks and gossip and truth, to try to find your will and your purpose. We thank you for the open space, the open minds, and the open wills to your truth. And that truth is realized according to your purpose for each person, because you've made each of us unique. No one is the same or duplicate of another. And so we thank you, Lord God, that you have given us a pastor whose mind is open enough to allow the study of your word with critique and firmness, with understanding and perhaps misunderstanding, with application, and then prayerful need for application. Just as you placed Nehemiah and Ezra together for your purpose, one for another and the other for the other. But the coming together made the difference then, and is really making the difference now, because we must remember to praise you in the midst of any situation. We must remember to give you honor and glory and to permit your will to be done, not our will. We must remember that the house of God is really your house, and it doesn't have to be in a physical house, and that's what the Israelites found. It's just wherever you are is your house, and your people are your people, and since we're all people, we are your people. Whether we choose to follow you or not is the key. And so we thank you, Holy One, that you have allowed us to get a glimpse of Nehemiah's purpose and how Ezra comes to save the day in so many ways, to allow people to just take a glimpse of really what could happen and what was happening. And because we can't see history happening within our lives, although we are living histories, it's amazing for us to look back and to then glimpse of what might be in the future as we examine what's going on right before our eyes. And guess what, Holy One? You are allowing us wisdom that we might know how to respond at this time for your blessed purpose in the building of your kingdom this day in 2022. And at this time of the church, while grace is still abounding, at this point in our lives, while we're still able to see each other's face and to feel each other's touch and to know the voice of God and to realize that there are many voices, but the voice of God supersedes. And we thank you, Holy One, that you're allowing us to understand equality versus equity and justice versus injustice and truth versus untruth, all in our discussion tonight. Thank you, Holy One, that you don't censor your people because you're God. And God is not good. We thank you for allowing us to be who we are and for acknowledging that you are God. Thank you for the leaders you sent for our class tonight, Reverend Dr. Miller. Thank you for each student, and we're all learners and students of yours. Continue to bless, heal, and restore. Continue, Holy One, to be the one and true and living God. Continue to forgive us. We sure do stand in the need of forgiveness. And yet allow us to be forgiving of others, that all might know what you're teaching us, that all might come running to this table to join and to be a part of what you're doing because of your equity and your truth and your need for sharing that truth. We ask that you continue to bless us, Father, and use us for the building of the kingdom, that no one will be left out, because the kingdom is yours. In the name of Jesus, do we pray and we thank you. As we pray for the people of the world, the leaders and lay, for the kings, the queens, mothers and fathers and children, for those who have yet to come to know you. And again, we thank you for our pastor and for the work you're doing in metropolitan through the lay and clergy. For it does not yet appear what you shall do on your purpose. In the name of Jesus, we pray, and we thank you just for the privilege of prayer. In his name do we shout and say thank you and hallelujah. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for being part of tonight. The next week's work is in the chat.